we have a full deck for today. So just so you were aware, we are going to start out this morning's class reviewing some of chapter 4 about interviewing. However, this is going to be very basic, very quick, because we have our exercise at the end of class that I want to save time for. So please make sure that you read chapter 4 and understand a lot of the nuances of interviewing skills. You will be asked after your pitch is approved for your feature story 1 to create a question list. I did this in MC 200 if you took me for that class. And you need to make sure that that question list aligns with the things that you're supposed to be asking in interviews according to your textbook and according to my lectures. So strap in. We will get on this wild ride of learning how to interview. And then, as I said before, we're going to do a fun little exercise at the end of class. I'm having to put you guys on a separate monitor today. So if you have questions, shout them out. Otherwise, mute yourself. But if you have any questions, please feel free to stop me and ask. All right, so we are going to skip the newsroom huddle today. We are going to have our full class on Friday is essentially going to be a newsroom huddle because you guys are going to pitch your story ideas for your feature 1, and we're going to talk through them like we would in a newsroom huddle. But please keep in mind that you should be staying up on current events. Your current events quiz grades 1 are in, so you may be able to look and see whether or not you need to study current events more depending upon what grade you got. So in terms of why sourcing and interviews are important in journalism, well, it's because they make up about a very large portion of what we do as journalists. 95% of all journalism relies on citing sources. And so it is very rare for you to have any type of article, any broadcast story that doesn't have some kind of source in it. Because since we cannot rely on personal expertise or personal opinion, personal emotion, that means we have to get those things from other places, other sources. So we want to use people most often as sources because it's what the audience can relate to. It's what we feel connected to as we are reading and watching journalism. However, documents are also an important source because we can really drive back to them and point to like, hey, here is this physical document that says this, and that is a fact, right? So the main purpose of sourcing or interviewing is to verify information or claims to make sure that we have the facts that prove what we're saying. We want sources who can provide opinions, since we cannot, that can provide emotions, since we cannot, give expertise on a topic, and we're typically wanting this expertise to come from an expert or an official, or give personal perspective or testimony to what one person is experiencing. So there are 2 main types of sources. There are official sources and non-official sources. Which one is most common in journalism? I'm just checking to pick something up on here. Which one's most common in journalism?
Official sources.
Official sources far outweigh non-official sources in journalism. So an official source is considered someone who has power and authority over the general public, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're talking only about elected officials. This can be the president or CEO of a company because they have some authority in their position, right? It could be spokespeople or press PR representatives, right? It could be law enforcement, first responders. So these are people who hold a title that make them official in whatever capacity they are in. Again, these are the most frequently used sources. About 75% of all sources used in journalism are officials. However, we really, in feature story writing, what we're doing for this class, want to rely more heavily on non-officials, and we'll talk about why. The reason that officials are used most often in journalism are because they're the people that you know are available. It is part of their job to be available to the press, right? That's why all police units or sheriff's offices have a public information officer, because there's someone whose job it is to interact with the press, to be available. Often these official sources are media trained, which makes it easier for us as journalists to interact with them because they know the drill, they know what's going on. They are often very reliable, because if you call a source, an official source, and you say, hey, I need to meet with you at noon at this location, they're like, okay, I can do it, right? And you know, when you show up at noon to that location, they're going to be there. And so that, again, it makes our jobs easier to use officials. But the drawback is that although all sources, official or non-official, have an agenda, official sources' agenda are to share their talking points, to drive the conversation to what they want the public to know, which can mean hiding details that don't make their organization or their official capacity look good, because they are wanting to represent the entity that is larger than themselves. As an elected official, that can even be as large as the government, right? But often it's also just making themselves look good. Their responses are often going to be rehearsed, meaning that they have thought about what they're going to say, and they know the limits of what they can and cannot say. For instance, if there is an active investigation that's ongoing, a police officer or PIO is not going to give you details about the investigation because they are legally limited as to what they can say, partly for the safety and protection of their investigation. What questions do we have about official sources? Okay, so in terms of non-official sources, these are typically people who have less access to platforms for making their voices heard. So they are average citizens. If you were talking about an education story, you'd be talking about the teachers and the students. They're not the people that have a direct line to the media. You're talking about witnesses, victims, suspects. So it's not the police officers, it's not the officials, it's the people affected by the situation. It could be the workers in a company as opposed to the leaders of that organization or the administrators. So we're talking about the everyday person with non-officials. We use non-official sources to vividly describe scenes or issues that they're passionate about. Again, it comes back to those opinions, those personal perspectives. And they provide a human element more than an official can, because an official, again, is representing an organization or an entity. So they are human, but they are kind of that like they're right in between a journalist who can't represent themselves at all, to an official who is representing an organization, to a person who is just representing themselves and therefore able to be themselves more than an official could. We rely on non-officials for the colorful details, for the emotions, for the descriptions, for the testimonies or unique perspectives of what they experienced. And a lot of times you can use non-officials to uncover greater truths. Whistleblowers are often like lower on the hierarchy in a company, and they notice something that's going on that the administration is not willing to release to the public. And so they uncover the details and bypass their administration and go to the press. And so they can help in investigative pieces as well to help bypass those talking points that officials are required to hold to. So again, we have to keep in mind that non-officials, of course, have their own agenda for why they would want to talk to the media. A lot of times it's so that they can have their version of the story told, and they want to make themselves look good. So do we understand the differences between an official source and a non-official source? Cool. I know this is pretty basic, but it's important for us to keep in mind. And again, for this class, for in-depth feature writing, you more typically want to rely on non-official sources because they provide the in-depth coverage that we need. But you will still need to use official sources in order to verify facts and get basic organizational information. Now, on top of people-based sources, human sources, we have data and document sources. And documents allow us to provide data that are hard facts that put all of our human sources into context. So it is the facts that we can then cite as journalists. There are many different types of documentation that we use as journalists. This can include police records, financial records, statistical reports, approval and voting records, sales. There are just a myriad of different types of documentation that we can use. It's important, this is not a law class, you do have to take media law, but it's important for you as a journalist to know your rights. And remember that open records laws and journalism laws differ state by state. So for Alabama, every citizen has a right to inspect and take a copy of any public writing of the state unless it has been expressly sealed by a court for a particular reason. So what is covered in that law? It's anything that's written, typed, printed, either a document or even a map. So that includes images that are made by public officers of state, counties, and municipalities doing public business. That can include courts, public records, officer records, things like that. No purpose has to be stated when you file that you want to gain access to a document. You don't have to say why you're using it. However, Alabama does allow the person who's deciding whether they will grant you access, that person can request to know your purpose. So that differs state by state, and that's not a great thing that Alabama's open records law does. You do need to be honest in providing your reason if it is requested. There are no time limits in the state for how long the public official has to deliver you your public record. In the state law, it says once they have received the fee, then they're supposed to turn it over in a reasonable time. What does that mean if a public official is trying to hold back a document? If they don't want to share it, what can this mean?
They can be trying to hide the information or like keep it to themselves, maybe.
Yeah, there was just this like filing issue, and now it's going to be a couple more weeks before we can get you that document you requested, right? So this has become a way that journalists don't get access regularly to public records that someone, for whatever reason, are trying to keep back, whereas other states have time limits. Like, you must provide this document to this person within 5 business days, of the request once the fees have been received or whatever. So again, this is another way that Alabama's open record laws are not great. In addition, our state allows for you to be charged for public records, but that is determined based on the official and the office from which you're requesting it. So for instance, if you just want a record of the arrest made by the University of Montevallo Police, for instance, they're not going to charge you for that. But if you go to the marriage court, for instance, and you want to see whether someone filed for divorce or not, I don't know, they will charge you a fee. And that's been determined by that office, right? And so obviously having fees associated with public documents would be considered holding back press freedom. So that's another way that Alabama has an issue. So these are to obtain documents. But another important thing to remember is that we have open meeting laws in Alabama, which mean any government meeting, whether that's at like the city, county, state level, have to remain open to the public. meaning that you can just go to any meeting. Notice must be provided for those meetings. So they can't just call a city council meeting with 1 hour's notice. There has to be enough notice that the public could attend. There is an exception for executive sessions or those protected by federal state statutes, but those are very limited. Like there are very limited reasons that a meeting could be closed. But this means you can attend any government meeting that you want to attend. And that's an excellent way to get documents and data from official sources. Quick note about off the record, because this is everybody's favorite thing to say that they know, but off the record doesn't exist. It is not actually a real protection, right? But what it is it's an ethical agreement between a journalist and a source. The problem is that you can only be granted off the record if you ask for it before you tell the journalist. So you can't tell the journalist the tea, like you can't spill the tea and then be like, oh, but this is off the record, right? No, everything you just said to that journalist is fair game, right? So off the record can only be agreed to if it's something that has never been discussed before, that person doesn't tell you what's going to be off the record and they request it. Then you as a journalist do not need to agree that they be off the record. You're going to try to convince them to stay on the record, because if you agree to them being off the record, you cannot use that information. You cannot print that information because it is off the record. What you can do is you now have knowledge that this thing that's off the record exists. And so you can then go investigate it through other sources. That's the whole purpose of an off the record, is that they're telling you something that they want you to prove, but you have to go and do that as an enterprise journalist, right? So never publish or tell the name of your source if you agree to go off the record. You can actually face legal harm for doing that. This often extends to even telling your editor or your news director who your source is. You better trust that person implicitly, because if they use that name or information, then you have violated that protection, right? Now, there are some reasons that you would want to go off the record with an anonymous source. And when I say anonymous, it means that you know who that person is, but no one else knows who that person is, right? So the source could be physically or emotionally harmed because of the information they provided. The source could be subjected to professional or criminal consequences if the information is being provided, and those prosecutions would be unfair. If someone tells you they murdered someone, you should probably go ahead and report that, right? Because we don't care if they face criminal consequences. That's what they're supposed to do. And then if the reporter has a history of working with the source and a good reason to trust the information given, you might be more willing to do that. But again, do not allow someone to tell you things off the record. That's just a random like tidbit, but everybody always says that, and I want you to know what your rights are as a journalist. So where do we stop start in terms of getting sources? Well, we should always start at the top and work your way down. You want to start with official sources because they're the ones that can provide documentation and facts for you to verify the claims that are being made of what you're investigating. So you want to start with officials and then move to those who are affected, and then move to man on the street videos, man on the street interviews, which are just like those random people that you encounter while out on the scene. So let's take, for instance, the Fultondale tornado, right? How did we know the tornado was happening?
Well, at first there was a tornado watch alert that we all got on our phones and on the
Where does that come from, Julia? Where's the source of that alert?
official.
It's the National Weather Service, which would be an official organization. Good. Okay, so the officials gave us a warning first. Then what? So we knew that there was the possibility for this. How do we know the tornado was on the ground?
Presumably because somebody saw it.
So it could be that someone saw it, but it is more likely because it is a natural disaster that people who saw it were actually hiding and protecting themselves. You would hope that that's the case. It was probably the National Weather Service or local meteorologist serving at the behest of the National Weather Service who know that that tornado is on the ground, right? James Spann knows the tornado is on the ground before most of the people who are in that community know it's on the ground, right? So you start with the officials. Then what do? We go to Fultondale and we find those people who are affected. And now we're seeing all of their stories. And then while the journalists are out there on the scene talking to officials and talking to those affected, they're going to come across random people that they want to talk to. And that would be man on the street, just people that you're naturally gathering reactions from. You can also crowdsource through social media, asking for ideas and input. For instance, Cynthia Gould did a story this week about people who had lost their sense of taste and smell due to COVID and how they were coping with that in terms of like what they were eating and how they were preparing their meals. Well, how many people do you know that that's actually happened to, like that you personally know? Maybe like one, maybe two. But in order to really get a good representation of that, she posted on social media, hey, I'm doing this story. Is anyone affected by this? Do you know someone who'd be willing to talk to me? And she ended up getting 20 potential sources off of this one post within an hour, right? So social media can be a good place of crowdsourcing as well. That actually was a really good story that she did. So once you get the interview, once you know who your source is, you want to do interviewing basics. The main thing is that you want to do your research, okay? And you want to do your research prior to coming to that interview. You should never walk into an interview cold. You should know information about that source, who that person is, what their title is, how they're affected. You should basically know what that person's going to say before they say it, even if like you know it just very broadly speaking. Like, what is President Stewart going to say about the University of Montevallo? Is he going to talk smack about or is he going to be very like upbeat and like, hey, I really support our university? He's the president. He's going to be positive, right? Whereas if there's for instance, if there were a faculty member who is like, I don't feel safe on campus, and you're getting them for their opinion, you're getting them because they have a contrary opinion to Dr. Stewart. So you should have a good idea of what that source is going to say before you ever start. And you do that by doing your research. You should also research the topic and know like the basic who, what, where, when, why of what's going on. We need to be conversational in our interviews. It should never feel journalistic or professional. I mean, you need to be professional in your demeanor, but you should never be like, I'm the journalist and you're the source, right? You want to have a conversation because people are more likely to talk to people who they feel comfortable with. And so you put your source at ease. You ask them questions about their family. I used to make notes when I was a field reporter. Like if I were interviewing officials, I'd be like, mayor, 2 sons, oldest plays baseball, and so that the next time that I went and talked to the mayor, I'd be like, how's your son Ricky doing? Did he do well in his baseball season? And then I've created a relationship with that source. They're more willing to talk to me. And when stuff happens, they're more willing to call me because they think of me more in terms of like a person. When you're out in the field or you want to do the interview out in the field or where the person can see you, because again, you are less rehearsed when you're talking to a person, when you're having a conversation. This is why I highly discourage email and phone interviews, because people just don't talk the same. They don't have the same way of sharing information as when they can see you. Now, I understand we're in the COVID life, so, social distance, all of that is really, really important. I'm not diminishing that at all. But that's why I encourage you to do your interviews on Zoom if you're social distancing, so that you can at least have that person face to face. And then we always want to know the main question that you need them to answer. And that's going to tie to the central point of your nut graph. What's the why of your story? And that's going to be where you need to center your questions around the most. So there are different types of interviews that your textbook discusses. The most common, I mean, I've done all of these, but the most common is traditional, where you're sitting down and you're just asking each other questions in a Q&A. You can also have press conferences. These are probably the second most common, and we're going to practice one of those. But what that would mean is that the organization sends out a media release and says, meet at this day, this time, this place, and we're going to talk, about an issue that we want to talk about. But who has the most control in a press conference situation? It's the source. So we actually would prefer to have a traditional interview, because then we're the ones that have the most power. We have the most control over that setting. A ride along is if you were going along with an official, like shadowing them. I've done many ride alongs with police, or even I did one with firefighters where I went with them to all their firefighters. The coolest and scariest one I ever did was going with the storm chasers, and went up in a helicopter in the middle of a hurricane and went in the eye with them. That was really scary. I don't suggest that. Or tornado chasing and things like that. So the purpose of a ride along, though, is for you to experience what that person experiences and get exposure to real life with them. It's very similar to immersion, but immersion is usually with groups of people or non-official sources. And this is like the Nellie Bly, where you go in and you act like you're a mental health patient in an asylum to learn what the asylum is like, right? And so you're immersing yourself within those worlds. I don't expect you to do that. But I don't know, maybe you could, like for college night, for instance, if you're not actually on one of the college night teams, you could go and participate in that and write about it, and your experience. I don't know. Or you could recreate the scene. This is very common for crime stories, particularly cold case crimes, where you're asking the people who were involved in it to return back to that location to remember what it was like. And the whole purpose is that you're recreating the scene so you can get a more vivid description of what happened. I did this with the 2011 tornadoes too, where, a couple of weeks or months after, we would return back to the site with people, and be like, what used to be here? And they'd be like, that's where the Dixie Mart was. And I used to go there for groceries every day, and they're talking about their lives and how they've been affected. So it gives a little more color when you can recreate a scene. So in terms of those question lists, the things that you're preparing before you go into the interviews, you typically want to have all your questions written out, or at the very least, a set of keywords that you want to ask about. You should always, 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 always ask them to say and spell their name. You may think you know how to spell Caitlin, for instance, right? Caitlin, does everyone spell your name correctly? No. Right? And so, for instance, I had an interview where I still laugh about this, I'm sorry, but the woman, and I shouldn't laugh about it because it's her name and I should respect that, but her name was LaDasha. And so me, doing a very quick interview with her, went back and I put on her lower third super, and I think her last name was Legit Smith, right? And I put LaDasha Smith. Right? Well, she called the station super, super angry that we had misspelled her name, and her name was Smith. You would never know that unless you ask the person to say and spell their name, right? You need to know their title, how they want to be stated, You want to start with easy questions first to make them more comfortable, and then lead into harder ones as you go on. Think about follow-up questions that make sense, which requires that you're actively listening to what's going on and taking notes. Remember the main point that you want to get from your source. Are you looking for their expertise? Do you want emotion from them? Do you want a personal perspective? Do you need their opinion? And try to drive those things out. Don't stop the interview until you have that central point from your net graph and the main thing that you want to get from them done. You want to remain impartial. So don't ask leading or biased questions, and don't ask yes or no questions. Do you support the restrictions for COVID-19 that the University of Montebello has set forth? Well, that automatically frames the mind that they need to support them, right? Because saying no is a contrary opinion and it's harder to do. Instead, you could say, what do you think about the protocols of COVID-19, right? And then that person gets to freely express whether they support it or not. In addition, yes or no questions are often answered with yes or no. And that person will legit answer yes and stop talking. Can you use that in a quote? No. Also avoid long or double-barreled questions. Double-barreled means you're putting like an and or an or between it. Do you like cats and dogs? Well, what if you only like dogs? How do you answer that, right? So avoid double-barreled questions and have sources talk in full sentences at a third grade level so that you could quote them in a way that would make sense to your reader. If you have an official or an expert, try to get them to stop talking in their professional jargon. So for instance, when I'm talking with a doctor, I'm like, try to explain it to your third grade child. Don't tell me about the myocardial infraction. Tell me about your heart attack, right? And don't let them get off track, and be silent. Silence makes people uncomfortable and they will say anything to fill that silence. So silence is often golden in an interview setting. All right, so in a press conference, as I said before, a press conference is often called by an official or an organization for a particular purpose. Statements are usually provided at the beginning, and then we will allow a period for questions from journalists for a particular period of time. You often, as a journalist, need to live tweet important pressers, meaning that you're trying to listen, take notes, and do tweets all at the same time. You also need to get photos and videos during the presser so that you have images that you can put with your stories. And you need to record them so you'll have accurate quotes. So we're not ending class, don't everyone get excited, but in order to do your homework, we're going to do an exercise. So from this press conference that we're about to hold, you're going to write a feature article as if this were a real press conference that I'm doing. And you're going to write an article based on this mock press conference. It'll be due Thursday at midnight. You need to include at least 2 sources from the press conference, and you need to write them verbatim, direct quotes, right? This is going to give you practice in knowing how to do a press conference. As a reminder, your pitch feature is also due Thursday at midnight. There is a template that you use for your pitches. It's the same one you used in 200 if you took it with me. And then you will pitch verbally your top story idea in class, and we'll talk about it. And I'll even tell you in the class whether you're approved to do it or not. Any questions before we begin our press conference?
So tomorrow night we'll be submitting on Canvas our pitch to you, and then Friday we'll be presenting it in class.
That's correct. Yes. So turn in the written feature, because if you pitch something that I don't approve in class, then I'm going to go back through and look at your pitch 2 and 3. You're actually pitching 3 story ideas in the written document, but you are only doing one of them. They're like your backup ideas in case your first one isn't your top choice. Make sense? All right. Well, let's begin this press conference. Can y'all just see me? Is that who you see now? Excellent. All right. So Oh, actually, I do need to share this. Sorry, give me 1 second. So you have been called today as members of the press to Pembroke University in order to discuss some of our COVID regulations. And so joining us first is Pembroke University President, Dr. George Feeney, and he will now be making his statement at this time. Thank you for joining us today, everyone. The university is continuing to monitor the global COVID-19 outbreak and is taking proactive steps to keep our campus safe. Pembroke is one of the largest and safest campuses in the Southeast due to our increased protective measures and regular testing precautions. Compared to other universities our size, we have fewer cases on average and are one of the few still able to offer in-person learning environments daily to students who wish to take these types of classes. We are continuing to follow our Penn Protective Plan, which was developed from federal, state, local, and professional resources. The health and safety of everyone on campus is paramount, and Pembroke is planning to continue enhancing our cleaning efforts, utilizing personal protective equipment, and modifying traditional classroom settings, among other steps. Before returning for spring, students were required to submit re-entry testing, and we will continue to offer regular Sentinel testing to all on-campus students, faculty, and staff on a regular basis to monitor our cases. We will do everything we can to keep our student body of 1,500 safe this semester and moving forward. We have had a small increase in COVID-19 on campus this week after 106 students who were all living in 2 of our dorms tested positive this week. Thankfully, most of these students are asymptomatic. Most of those students also live within driving distance, so they will likely be quarantining at home. Those that aren't local students will continue living in their dorms, although isolating from others. The safety of the university community is our main concern. The amount of dedication and resiliency shown by everyone at Pembroke over the past few months is inspiring, and we have all navigated this unprecedented situation together. I would like to thank everyone who has worked tirelessly to help the university manage these trying times and develop a plan to continue to deliver a world-class education while ensuring the health and safety of everyone on campus. I now introduce to you Dr. Gregory House, who is the Medical Director of Student Health Services. I am Dr. House. The university is continuing to monitor the global COVID-19 outbreak and is taking proactive steps to keep our campus safe. To support a safe and healthy environment at Pembroke, the university has implemented weekly Sentinel testing across our campus beginning Tuesday, January 26th, and we will continue to do that through the end of the spring semester in the main hall meeting room. Sentinel testing is a random sampling of all asymptomatic students, faculty, and staff to understand the underlying prevalence of infection on campus so we can respond promptly to any outbreaks or increases in infection rates. Every week, we plan to randomly test at least 3 to 5% of our on-campus population, and all members of the university community are expected to participate in this important preventative measure. GuideSafe will be conducting our Sentinel testing services. If an on-campus student, faculty, or staff member is chosen for testing, they will be notified through their Pembroke email with further instructions. If you have not already done so, please set up an account to be included in Sentinel testing. You can find information about how to set up an account on our website by searching for coronavirus information off the main page. As a reminder, if you are having symptoms and have a recent exposure, follow the Pembroke Protection Plan and do not participate in this new Sentinel testing. The full Pembroke Protection Plan can be found on our website at pembroke.edu/protectionplan. We will now take questions for both Dr. Feeney, Dr. House, and our 2 professors and 3 students who are available. Are there any questions from the press?
Yes, I have a question. So you both talked about a lot of things concerning physical health, but what about the mental health of your students and what you're doing to best prepare them for, a lot of them are isolating at this time, and many could be down or have just a big impact on their mental health. What are y'all doing to ensure that your students have the best mind space during this pandemic?
So I, Dr. House, can speak to that since we do have counseling services available for free for all faculty, staff, and students at Pembroke University. We hope that those resources will be utilized.
I have a question for Dr. George Feeney.
Yes.
What is how are students getting food during this time, the ones that live in dorms? And are there any refunds towards students for food that had to go home to isolate?
That is a great question. The students who are isolating within their dorms are able to receive meals from our student dining services. There is not a refund for students who are needing to go back to their remote learning spaces because they are expected to return to campus after their isolation period.
Thank you, Dr. Feeney.
Thank you.
Okay, I have a question for Dr. House.
Yes.
You mentioned that 3 to 5% of the students will be expected to take the test, but is it a requirement for the students to take the test?
We are unsure at this time whether Sentinel testing will be a required practice or not. At this point, we are requesting that anyone who is randomly selected for Sentinel testing participate, but there are currently no requirements to do so if chosen.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Yes.
What are y'all doing for those students that know they've tested positive but haven't reported it since they're affecting other students?
Would you like to direct your question towards anyone in particular, Ms. Myra?
Dr. Feeney.
All right. So we believe that the students are responsible for their own physical health. Any student that is exhibiting symptoms or who tests positive is highly encouraged to isolate within their own dorms, or if possible, to return to their home areas.
Question for Dr. House.
Yes.
Are students that show symptoms of the flu and test negative for COVID but test positive for the flu, what are the standards for that?
Well, the Pembroke Protection Plan only covers COVID-19 cases. We currently have no guidelines for students experiencing flu. However, as a medical professional, I would say that it's important for students who are experiencing any types of viral symptoms to stay at home and quarantine. However, there are no academic protections for students experiencing flu. You should probably talk to your instructor about that.
Question for Dr. Feeney.
Yes.
I know that you've said that you guys are able to offer in-person learning. What precautions and changes have you guys made to make that possible for your students while still keeping them safe and healthy?
So as of this week, after our small increase in the number of students who tested positive, we are beginning to require masks be worn for all in-person learning environments. And we are encouraging all faculty members to try to social distance and keep 6 feet between themselves and their students. Those are the primary precautions that we're currently taking.
Can I get a follow-up, please?
Sure.
Why were these not instated previously? What kind of led you guys to the thought process of not putting these in place until you've seen such a great increase in cases?
Well, as I stated before, Pembroke University is one of the largest and safest campuses in the Southeast due to the measures that we have tried to take in the past. We are a very rural campus and we have not seen hardly any cases, especially compared to campuses our size. And so until that time, we did not feel that they were necessary.
Question for Dr. Feeney. Was there an on-campus activity that was held without the campus knowing that caused this spike in COVID?
So to our knowledge, all of the students who tested positive live in North and South Halls. We believe that there was a party being held in North Hall that was responsible. It has been reported that there were about 300 people within the common area of North Hall during that time.
And what are the repercussions and punishments that these students are facing?
There are no punishments for these students, considering there were no restrictions on parties being held.
I have a question for Dr. Feeney.
Yes.
Are students allowed to go completely online this semester, or are in-person classes still being held?
All of our on-campus classes are still being held. It's a point of pride that Pembroke remains in-person learning environments. Our surveys show that that's what our students want and how they want to learn. Students who are needing to go remote can contact their instructors and find the best way of doing that. And we do, of course, offer a great online education system for certain classes, so students were able to sign up for those classes if they prefer to do so. We have about 2 minutes remaining in our press conference. If there are any questions that might want to be directed to someone who may help you with a feature in-depth article.
Question for...
Yes, Ms. Terry.
I have a question for Dr. House. You stated before returning for spring, students were required to take a COVID reentry test.
That's
so
correct.
if they tested positive, was there a delay for them returning?
Any student who tested positive was not allowed to return to campus. So only students who tested negative on this reentry testing were actually allowed to return to campus. Those were preventative measures we did take here at Pembroke.
I have a question for Dr. Feeney.
Yes.
Let's say, because some students probably don't even care about the coronavirus, like, will there be any disciplinary action for someone who defies the orders that have been put in place at the school now?
We currently don't have any restrictions that would have any academic punishments.
And if numbers continued rising, would Pembroke consider going completely online, or?
We would have to see a vast rise in cases, I believe, in our 1,500 student population for us to begin considering that. However, of course, you know, our administration cares deeply about the safety of our students and staff, and so therefore we will be monitoring the situation.
Quick question for Elle Woods. Given
Yes.
that your university has not put any restrictions on parties or other student activities, do you feel as though Pembroke actually is one of the safest campuses?
I'm so glad you asked, because I actually did attend that party at North Lawn and it was amazing. It's had some really good music and I met this really cute guy too. I mean, no one was social distance. It's a party, right? You have to be close to one another. And no, we weren't wearing a mask, but I mean, that's not a problem. I think everything is fine. I want to finish my degree so I can get into Harvard Law School and show everyone who doubts me that I can be a fierce, fashionable lawyer. If Pembroke moves to remote learning, that just wouldn't happen. So it would be an absolute travesty to have to leave campus and be alone at home all that time. That is an invasion of my freedom, right? All right, well, it looks like we are at the end of our press conference, everyone. Y'all really missed out on me doing a good Dolores Umbridge, a good Howard. I could have brought it. Remember, it's important for feature stories not to go just to the official sources. So we will have some pretty fact-based stories coming out, I'm sure. But I hope that you guys picked up on some of the nuances of a press conference, and I look forward to reading those assignments. Y'all have a great rest of your day. If you have any questions, I'll stay behind for a minute. With the second half of our press conference, we are going to pretend that we had our two speakers, Dr. George Feeney and Dr. House, present in the official press conference the other day. And now you have gone out and are enterprising some feature reactions to the news that we got from Pembroke on Wednesday. And so you have 4 different people who have offered to speak to you for your feature reaction piece. And so that is what we're going to do today. And so we will kind of be doing group interviews. Obviously, this is not how you would do a reaction feature, but given the format of the class, this is what's going to work best. So you have available to you, you have available to you Dr. Henry Jones, who's a professor, Dr. Dolores Umbridge, also a professor, and 3 students at varying levels and different majors, Roy Gilmore, Elle Woods, and Howard Wolowitz, who may or may not have similar or contrasting opinions about what we learned from our press conference on Wednesday. We will have exactly 10 minutes to complete this interview. And from these interviews, you will then do your feature version of this piece. Are there any questions before we get started with the mock exercise? Okay, so we know that we wrote our hard news piece from the conference on Wednesday. And so this one is for the feature piece that you will do for this part of the assignment. All right, I open up the floor to journalists for questions.
A question for Mr. Gilmore.
Ms. Gilmore, yes, I'm happy to answer those questions.
Do you think that the pen production plan is effective?
Absolutely not. This is an outrage to the student body. We need to investigate these issues further. As a student, I don't feel safe on campus anymore. I'm thinking of returning home to Stars Hollow to make sure that I'm personally protected. But that would mean dropping out for a semester, and that would ruin my plans for graduation. It's not fair to make students choose between their lives and their education. So no, the Pembroke Protection Plan does not help students.
Okay.
Follow-up question for Ms. Gilmore.
Yes.
Do you feel that the students who were at the party and are holding gatherings should be held accountable?
You know, that's a great question. I'm not sure whether it's the responsibility of the students to know how to act. This was really on our university to set guidelines in place so that the student body knew what was appropriate. Of course, there are students like me who know and research what we need to be doing, but that's not the expectation for every single student at Pembroke. This is on our leadership for not protecting students better. So no, I don't think that they necessarily need to be punished because there were no guidelines set in place when the party happened.
What kind of restrictions do you feel like are appropriate?
Well, I think we should be following guidelines from the CDC, health officials, both at the federal and state level. And some of those prevention measures that, you know, in my research that we have seen that are effective would be making sure that we're social distancing, requiring masks in public, making sure that we take students who are testing positive and quarantine them away from other students. It's an outrage that they're staying in dorms with students who are not positive. That's how this virus will continue to spread. And so I think that those are some of the basic protections we need. And then if this continues to spread and if Pembroke cannot stop the rise in cases, we should definitely move to remote learning for the protection of all students so we don't have to choose between our lives and our education.
Mr. Wallowitz, I have a question.
Yes.
So I would like to get a second opinion. Do you think that enough is being done at the school, and do you feel safe?
Scientifically speaking, we're setting ourselves up for a major virus outbreak here. You don't have to be a genius like me to know that putting students who have COVID in dorms with students who are not sick is unsafe. And having those sick students return home could spread the virus even further outside the campus area. The university needs to take action and quarantine those students together so they will not infect healthy members of the campus population.
Thank you.
That's a terrible Molowitz impression, by the way. Let's deal with it. Good. Thank you.
I have a question for Ms. Woods.
Yes.
Ms. Woods, you stated at the press conference that you were present at the party held on campus. And you also stated that with remote learning options, you feel like it would be a violation of your freedom. Could you expand on that thought just a little bit?
Well, I mean, so what are you wanting me to say? That like not going to parties should not be part of college life in a quarantine era? I mean, I just see that it's a violation of my rights as an American to tell me what I can and cannot do. And since I am pre-law, I totally know what the legal ramifications are of trying to tell the student body what they should be doing. And honestly, remote learning is just so silly because the most important part of college is being around people, being around other students. That's how I learn best.
Ms. Woods, what are the legal ramifications of that?
Of what?
Of you saying that if the university was to tell you not to have a party?
Well, the legal ramifications are that's totally against my rights as an American. You cannot tell me what I can and cannot do. And there was nothing built into our contractual obligations as students here at Pembroke that we would be expected to just live in isolation forever. So I think Pembroke changing the requirements for students mid-semester is just completely unfair and it's not legal.
Ms. Woods, do other colleagues of yours find the same view as you?
Oh, absolutely. Every single student on campus believes that this is totally fine and that nothing is wrong. I mean, there may be like one or two students like that nerd Rory Gilmore who think that we need to like move to remote learning and such, but I promise you, every student that I know wants to be on campus, they want to be in class, and they want to continue to party.
Thank you.
Ms. Woods, I have a question for you.
Yes.
So what would you do if you contracted the coronavirus? What would you do?
Well, I have not contracted the coronavirus, so I don't know what the regulations are for that. I mean, I'm sure some doctor could tell me, but I mean, we don't know as students what we're supposed to do if we actually test positive. By the way, I love your pigtail buns. They are so cute.
Thank you.
Ms. Woods, have you tested negative since the party, or have you been tested at all?
No, why would I get tested? I don't feel sick.
You could be asymptomatic and spreading right now. How does that make you feel considering you're in a room full of people? Do you feel any guilt if you were to spread that to someone at high risk?
No, I mean, everybody, since I'm asymptomatic and I'm not feeling bad at all, I'm obviously not sick. And so therefore, there's no reason for anyone to be concerned. And besides, we're all young and we all know, scientifically speaking, no young person has ever contracted COVID-19.
Dr. Umbridge, I have a question for you.
Yes.
So students like Ellie Woods stated that most of the students have the same viewpoint, which is less restrictions at the university. Do you share the same view, and do you think students should have this view?
Absolutely. Everything is fine. The university is doing the best it can to protect everyone involved. There is no reason to do anything different. I would hate doing remote teaching, especially as we're already 3 weeks into term. I don't even like that they were doing Sentinel testing. It should be optional for those who want it. I feel fine, and I want to continue to teach my students the way that I want to.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question from our journalist.
I have a question for Ms. Gilmore.
Yes.
Ms. Gilmore, do you feel that because the university is not taking into consideration some viewpoints of students about stricter regulations, do you feel like as a senior that your future as a graduate is going to be affected?
Well, absolutely. We're talking about things that are life and death here. And as much as I love education and as much as I want to be a journalist in the future, I can't do that if my life is at risk. And so absolutely, I think that we have to have stricter protections here on campus in order to make sure that we all have the best viable future. Does no one want to speak to Dr. Jones?
I have a question for Dr. Jones.
Yes, Misty, no.
So your colleague, Dr. Umbridge, has shared that she is kind of interested in keeping things the way they are at Pembroke. Do you share those sentiments, or do you have a different feeling?
Absolutely not. We need to learn from what has worked in the past. Research shows that quarantining sick people away from others is best. The affected students should be quarantined in a separate area away from our unaffected population. We also need to be testing everyone to ensure who is positive and not considering the asymptomatic students could be spreading it without knowing it. That's just crazy. Faculty need to be protected as well. We need to move to remote learning options immediately before the virus crushes us like a rolling boulder. All right, that was a great press conference, everyone. Good job. I'm obviously not an actor, but it was fun. So thank you for.
Oh, I liked Wallowitz.
Thank you. I thought that was my weakest one, but it's okay. We'll improve it for future semesters.